She stopped. He stopped. "I beg your pardon," she said. He met her eyes even and unapologetic. "I'm not criticizing you, Miss Turner. I'm telling you that Lily eats her share, and not a bite more, and you can stop rearranging your own plate like you're something invisible at your own table." The directness of it landed somewhere between astonishing and infuriating, and she wasn't sure which direction she landed first. "You've been here 5 days, Mr. Cole," she said. "I know that." That night, she sat on the porch after the lamps went out, listening to the frogs in the creek bottom and the far-off thunder that rolled around these hills every July without ever quite committing to rain. The light in the barn loft was a narrow yellow bar under the door. She wondered if he slept well. She wondered what the quieter thing was that he was looking for, and whether this farm mortgaged and dry season beaten and mocked by half the county was anywhere in the neighborhood of it. She wondered for the first time in a very long time what she was looking for herself, and then she heard it. Down on the south road, not the sound of the night, not the wind or the frogs, or the distant, indecisive thunder. The sound of movement, slow and deliberate. The kind of slow that didn't mean passing through. The kind of slow that meant someone was looking for something specific, or someone specific. The yellow light in the barn loft went out, not gradually the way a lamp burns down, all at once, like a hand had covered it. Abigail sat very still on the porch steps and watched the road and did not say a word. Whatever Ethan Cole was, he was something considerably more than a drifter with a broken wagon wheel, and a quiet daughter, and a willingness to fix her fence line. She just didn't know yet what that something was. But whatever it was coming up the south road right now, moving slow and deliberate through the Montana dark, and it wasn't going to wait for morning to arrive. She didn't sleep. She sat on the porch long after the sound on the south road faded, and she didn't go inside, and she didn't call out to the barn, and she didn't do anything except sit with her hands folded in her lap and watch the dark. Like the dark owed her an explanation. By the time the first pale gray of morning started showing at the edge of the sky, she'd made a decision. She was going to ask him directly. She was going to walk to that barn, look Ethan Cole in the eye, and ask him what he was running from and what those men on the south road wanted with him. She was going to do it calmly, professionally, and without any of the strange sideways feelings she'd been carrying around all week getting in the way. She walked to the barn. She pulled the door open. Ethan was already up, already working mending the leather on the spare harness with his back to her. And he said without turning around, "I know what you're going to ask." "Then you can save us both some time," she said. He set the harness down and turned to face her. He looked like he hadn't slept either. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there the night before, and his jaw was set in the way she'd learned meant he was working through something he didn't have a clean answer to. "Those men on the road last night," she said, "they looking for you?" "Yes." "Are you in trouble with the law?" "No." "Are you going to tell me who they are?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Not yet." She felt the anger rise fast and sharp in her chest. "Mr. Cole, I've got enough problems on this property without—" "I know that," he said. "I know that better than you think I do, Miss Turner." He held her gaze. "I am not going to bring trouble to your door. I give you my word on that, and I don't give that word easy." "Your word," she said flatly. "Yes, ma'am." The word of a man who won't tell me his last name's real. Something flickered in his eyes. Fast. There and gone. But she saw it, and he knew she saw it, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched long and taut between them. "Give me 2 more weeks," he said. "Just 2 weeks. And if at the end of those 2 weeks you still want us gone, I'll go without argument, and I'll leave the channel dug and the fences repaired and this farm in better shape than I found it." She studied him. He didn't look away. 2 weeks, she said finally. "And then you tell me the truth." "Yes, ma'am." She turned to go, and then she stopped. "Lily up." "She's in the loft still. She sleeps late when she's comfortable somewhere." Abigail nodded, once said nothing, and walked back to the house to make breakfast. The 2 weeks passed in the strange suspended way that intense things do, feeling both endless and over in a blink. Ethan dug the second irrigation channel in 6 days flat, working from first light until the heat made the ground too hard to break, then switching to fence repairs and barn maintenance through the cooler late afternoon. He worked with the disciplined, unsentimental efficiency of someone who had done physical labor their whole life, which didn't fit the other things about him that didn't add up: the careful way he spoke, the precision of his vocabulary when he forgot to keep it plain, the way he'd sometimes go still while reading the land, like a man who understood agriculture at a level no ordinary drifter should. Abigail noticed all of it. She filed it away without comment. What she couldn't file away so easily was Lily. The child had settled into Abigail's kitchen like she'd always belonged there, which was a thing Abigail found almost physically painful in how good it felt. Lily helped roll dough with absolute seriousness, tongue stuck out slightly in concentration. She named every chicken individually and insisted on knowing each one's personality. She asked Abigail once out of nowhere, in the middle of shelling peas, "Did you always live here by yourself?" Abigail kept shelling. "Since my father passed, 3 years ago." "Were you lonely?" "A beat. Sometimes." "I was lonely too," Lily said simply. "After Mama died, even with Papa." She looked up with those serious dark eyes. "Are you still lonely now?" Abigail looked at her for a long moment. "Less than I was," she said carefully. Lily nodded like that was a perfectly satisfactory answer and went back to her peas. Abigail had to get up and go stand at the back window for a minute before she could trust her face again. It was the following Tuesday when she needed to go into Millhaven for flour salt and lamp oil, and Ethan said he'd hitch the wagon. She told him she could hitch it herself. He said he knew that. He hitched it anyway. She didn't argue, partly because she was tired, and partly because the look on his face said arguing would be a waste of both their mornings. Lily rode between them on the bench, pointing out everything they passed with the commentary of a very small and very confident tour guide, and Abigail found herself smiling in a way she had to stop herself from examining too closely. Millhaven had a way of curing her of good moods quickly. She felt it the moment they rolled down the main street. The looks, the way people's conversations paused and then resumed a little too carefully. A group of women outside the dry goods store watched her climb down from the wagon, and one of them, Martha Coles, leaned toward the woman beside her and said something behind her hand, and they both looked at Ethan with the particular kind of curiosity that had sharp edges. Inside the store, the owner's wife, Patricia Harding, rang up Abigail's items with a smile that had nothing warm in it. "Didn't know you had company out at the Turner place," she said. "Passing through," Abigail said. Patricia looked out the window to where Ethan was loading the wagon bed with the flour sacks. "He doesn't look like he's passing through." "He's working on the channel," Abigail said evenly. "Of course he is." The smile stayed exactly where it was. "You know people talk, Abigail. People always talk. They're saying—" Patricia lowered her voice like she was doing Abigail a kindness. "Well, they're saying a man that looks like that doesn't take up on a woman's property out of the goodness of his heart. They're saying you must be paying him somehow, and they're saying, and I'm only telling you this as a friend, that it don't look right, a woman your size and situation taking in a young man and his child like you got something to offer him." The store went very quiet. Abigail felt the words land in her chest, the way they always did, not like a surprise, because nothing these women said surprised her anymore, but like a weight added to a weight she'd been carrying so long, she'd stopped noticing how much it cost her to stand upright. She picked up her bag. She counted her change. She said, "Thank you, Patricia," in a voice that meant the opposite of the words, and she walked out. Ethan was right there on the steps. She didn't know how much he'd heard through the open door. His face was very still in the way she'd learned meant he was controlling it deliberately. "Ready," she said. "In a moment," he said. He walked back into the store. She stood beside the wagon and listened to the sound of Ethan's boots on the plank floor, and then the sound of his voice, quiet, the way a cold thing is quiet, and Patricia Harding saying something in a higher register than usual, and then the sound of boots coming back out. He came down the steps and took the reins without looking at her. "What did you say?" Abigail asked. Nothing that wasn't true, he said. Mr. Cole, she won't speak to you that way again, he said. And that was all he said. And something in the flatness of his certainty made Abigail believe him completely, which raised its own set of questions she didn't have time to sort out on a Tuesday morning in front of the dry goods store. On the ride home, Lily fell asleep against Abigail's arm, her small head heavy and trusting, and Abigail didn't move for the entire 3 miles home so as not to wake her. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. She trusts you, he said low enough not to disturb the child. She trusts everybody, Abigail said. No, he said. She doesn't. She's particular, actually. She just doesn't make a performance of it. He glanced sideways. She's usually right about people. Abigail looked down at the sleeping child. She didn't say anything because she didn't have words for what was happening in her chest right then. And she'd learned a long time ago that reaching for words you don't have only makes you sound like a fool. That evening, after Lily was in the loft and the supper things were put away, Ethan stayed at the kitchen table longer than usual, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and Abigail knew without asking that something was working its way to the surface. My wife's name was Clara, he said. She stopped wiping the counter and waited. She died 2 winters ago. Fever. It came fast. He was looking at the cup, not at her. Lily was 4. She remembers her, but not the way you remember something you can hold. More like the way you remember a feeling. I'm sorry, Abigail said, and she meant it in the plain, unadorned way that real sorrow deserves. I stayed too long after, he said. In the place we were, in the life we'd built there. He paused. It wasn't a bad life. It was full. But it wasn't mine. Not really. It was a life I'd been put into, and I'd been meaning to leave it for a long time, and Clara dying was the thing that finally made staying impossible. He looked up then, and his eyes were direct in that particular way of his. I'm not telling you everything, he said. I know that. I'm telling you what I can. Is that supposed to make me feel better about the men on the South Road? She asked. Something crossed his face. Guilt, she thought. Real guilt, not performed. They won't come to the house, he said. They're looking, but they don't know exactly where I am, and they won't come onto private property without cause. You sound sure of that. I know how they operate, he said. I know them. She looked at him steadily. How well? He held her gaze. Well enough. She should have pushed harder. She knew that sitting there. She should have demanded the whole truth right then and held the 2-week deadline over him like the threat it technically was. But there was something in his face, not evasion exactly, but something she recognized from her own reflection in harder times. The look of a person trying to hold a shape while something important finished breaking apart. She said, "Good night, Mr. Cole," and went to bed and lay there for an hour, staring at the ceiling and reminding herself she was a practical woman who didn't make foolish decisions, which worked right up until she remembered the way he'd walked back into that store in Millhaven. 3 days later, Doyle came back. He rode into the yard at midday, and Abigail was at the fence line when she saw him, and she straightened up and started walking toward the house with the particular stride she'd developed for situations that required her to look like nothing could touch her. Ethan was on the porch before she got there. She didn't know how he moved that fast. Doyle pulled up short when he saw him. He hadn't expected anyone to be there. She could see the recalculation happening behind his eyes. "Miss Turner," Doyle said. "Mr. Briggs wanted me to remind you about the 30-day—" "She heard you the first time," Ethan said. His voice was pleasant. That was the strangest part. He was standing on the porch steps with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he sounded perfectly pleasant the way a man sounds when he's entirely certain of exactly where the line is and exactly how far the other person is from being allowed to cross it. Doyle looked at him. "And you are helping with the farm," Ethan said. "That right." Doyle's eyes moved over him in the slow, assessing way of a man trying to figure out a stranger's threat level. "Well, this is a private business matter between Mr. Briggs and—" "What's the figure?" Ethan said. Doyle blinked. I beg your pardon. The banknote. What's the outstanding figure? Doyle glanced at Abigail, who was watching Ethan with an expression she couldn't entirely control. That's not... Is it a matter of public record? Ethan said. Because if it is, you can tell me the figure. And if it isn't, you can deliver Miss Turner's message to Mr. Briggs that she'll be in touch through her attorney when she's ready, and not a day before. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing Abigail had heard in months. Doyle stared at him. She don't have an attorney. She does now, Ethan said, and his voice didn't change by a single degree. Doyle looked at Abigail. She met his eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing she needed to add to what was already sitting in the air between all three of them, heavy and exact. Doyle left. He didn't look back this time. Abigail waited until the hoofbeats were gone, and then she turned to Ethan with her arms crossed and her voice very careful. I don't have an attorney. I know, he said. So what exactly? I know someone, he said. In Billings, he's good. He can review the banknote, look at Briggs's acquisition agreements across the county, find the leverage. He looked at her directly. There's always leverage, Miss Turner. Men like Briggs always overreach somewhere. They can't help it. She stared at him. How do you know how men like Briggs operate? He was quiet for exactly one beat too long. Mr. Cole, she said, her voice dropping to something low and level. That's the second time in a week you've known something that a drifter working fence repairs on a Montana farm has no business knowing. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them moved. 2 weeks, he said finally. You gave me 2 weeks. I'm counting, she said. She went inside. She stood at the kitchen window. Her hands were perfectly steady, which surprised her because her heart was doing something complicated and fast that she hadn't given it permission to do. Outside, Ethan stood on the porch for a long time, looking out at the road where Doyle had disappeared, and then he reached into his shirt pocket and took out a folded piece of paper and looked at it for a long time before folding it back up and putting it away. She didn't see what was on it. But that night, for the second time, the South Road came alive with slow-moving shadows after dark, and this time there were 2 of them, and they stopped at the fence line for nearly a full minute before moving on. And when Abigail went to the barn the next morning, she found a name carved very faintly into the wood of the post beside the loft ladder. Not Ethan Cole. A different name. One she didn't recognize. Not yet. She asked him about the name that same morning, standing in the barn doorway, with the carved letters barely visible in the wood beside the ladder, 2 words pressed lightly like someone had done it without thinking, or maybe done it in the dark. E. Calloway. Is that you? She said. Ethan was at the work table with his back to her. He went still. Not the stillness of a man who didn't hear the question. The stillness of a man who had been waiting for it. Where'd you see that? He said. Post beside the ladder. She waited. Is that your name, Calloway? He turned around slowly. His face was doing that controlled thing again, the deliberate smoothing out of something underneath. And she'd learned enough about him in 2 weeks to know that the more controlled his face was, the more significant the thing being controlled. Yes, he said. Ethan Calloway. Yes. She let that settle. Why'd you give me a different one? Cole was my mother's name, he said. It's not a lie exactly. It's not the truth exactly either. He nodded once. He didn't try to argue that point, which she respected even while it made her angrier. The 2 weeks are up in 2 days, he said. I was going to tell you. All of it. Were you? Yes, Abigail. It was the first time he'd used her given name without the miss attached, and it landed with a weight she hadn't prepared for. I was. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing battle with something else in her chest, and neither side was winning cleanly. 2 days, she said, and walked back to the house. She didn't get 2 days. She got 1 afternoon. She was in the kitchen, flour on her hands, Lily at the table drawing horses with a charcoal stub, when she heard it. Wheels on the drive, more than one set, moving fast and deliberate, the way things move when they aren't asking permission. She went to the window. 3 carriages. Black lacquered wood brass fittings horses that cost more than her farm. moving up her dirt road like they owned the ground they were rolling over. Lily looked up from her drawing. Her face went the color of milk. "Go to the barn," Abigail said quietly. "Go find your father, right now." Lily was off the bench and out the back before Abigail finished the sentence. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the front door. The man who stepped down from the lead carriage was perhaps 45 broad through the shoulders, dressed in a suit that belonged in a city boardroom and not on a Montana farm road. He had Ethan's dark coloring, but none of Ethan's stillness. This man moved like something always expanding, always filling more space than it had been given, and his eyes, when they found Abigail, were the particular kind of cold that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Behind him stepped two others lawyers, by the look of their coats, and behind them a fourth man, who Abigail recognized with a jolt that went straight to her stomach. Doyle. "Miss Turner," the broad-shouldered man said, stopping at the base of her porch steps. "My name is Richard Calloway. I'm looking for my brother." The air changed when he said the name. She felt it. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said. "I think you do." His eyes moved over her with the same dismissive arithmetic that Patricia Harding's had used in the dry goods store, but colder. More deliberate. "His real name is Ethan Calloway. He's been living on your property under a false name." He paused to let that breathe. "I imagine he neglected to tell you who he was." She kept her face exactly where it was. "What do you want with him?" "Family business," Richard said. "Nothing that concerns you." "He's on my property," she said. "That makes it my concern." Something moved across his face, not anger exactly, but the mild irritation of a man who has decided he's being delayed by something beneath his notice. He looked past her, and she knew without turning that Ethan had come around the side of the house because Richard's expression changed. The irritation sharpened into something that looked almost like relief, which was more frightening than anger would have been. "Ethan," he said. "Richard." Ethan's voice came from just behind and to Abigail's left. He stepped up to stand beside her on the porch, not in front of her, not behind beside. She felt the heat of him in the July air and kept her eyes on Richard Calloway. "You didn't have to come yourself." "You weren't answering the letters." "I wasn't reading them." Richard looked at Abigail and then back at his brother with an expression she couldn't fully decode. "We need to talk, privately. Anything you say to me, you can say in front of Abigail," Ethan said. That was when she understood that whatever was coming was going to be very bad. Not because of what Ethan said, but because of how Richard looked when he said it, like he'd been hoping for exactly that. "All right," Richard said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document and held it up. "I need your signature on the consolidation agreement. The Hartwell acquisition closes in 40 days, and your proxy is required under the founding charter. The board has been patient, Ethan. They won't wait past this month." Ethan said nothing. "The Hartwell acquisition," Abigail said slowly because she knew that name. The whole county knew that name. Hartwell was the shell company that Harlan Briggs had been using to buy up farmland across 3 counties. She'd heard it at the Tuesday meetings. She'd seen it on the papers Doyle brought. "Calloway Corporation is behind the Hartwell acquisition." Richard looked at her like she'd spoken out of turn. "This is a private—" "Your company," she said to Ethan, and her voice came out very quiet and very clear, "is the one buying these farms." "No," Ethan said. His jaw was tight. "My brother's company. I walked away from the board 2 years ago." "You walked away without signing the divestment," Richard said. "Which means, legally, you are still a 23% stakeholder and your signature is still required to move Hartwell's assets." He looked at Abigail again, and this time the look held something deliberate in it. "You've been hiding on this woman's property for 2 weeks. I hope it was worth the delay." "Sign nothing," Abigail said to Ethan low and fast. "I'm not signing anything," Ethan said to his brother. What happened next happened quickly, the way things do when someone has planned for every possible answer, and your refusal was the one they prepared for most carefully. Richard turned toward the road and nodded once, and Doyle rode forward and handed Richard a second document, and Richard held it up for Abigail to see. "Miss Turner," he said, "I have here a letter of acceleration from First Territorial Bank of Millhaven. It was filed this morning. Your entire outstanding note principal and interest is due in full within 14 days. He let that land. Then he said, "However, Callaway Corporation is prepared to absorb that debt entirely in exchange for the deed to this property." The porch was completely silent. Abigail heard the frogs in the creek bottom, which was absurd because it was the middle of the day. But she heard them, and she heard her own heartbeat, and she heard Lily breathing somewhere behind the barn wall, where the child had clearly not gone as far as instructed. "You planned this," Abigail said, "not to Richard, to Ethan." The bank acceleration Briggs already had that ready. "Did you know?" Ethan's face told her the answer before he spoke it. "No," he said. "I didn't know he'd move this fast." "But you knew it was possible." A beat. "Yes." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. "Get off my property," she said to Richard Callaway. Richard tilted his head. "Miss Turner, I'd encourage you to think carefully. I said get off my property," she said. "You've got 10 seconds before I go inside for my father's rifle, and I am a very good shot, and this is the state of Montana, and a woman defending her own land from trespassers has rights that even your lawyers can't argue with in this county." Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan, and his expression said clearly that he had expected this too, and it was fine, because he had other options, and they would arrive shortly. He tipped his hat to her, a perfect mockery of courtesy, and walked back to his carriage. Doyle, as he turned his horse, gave Abigail a look that was almost sympathetic, which was the worst thing he'd ever done to her. Abigail waited until they were at the end of the drive. Then she turned to Ethan and said in a voice she barely recognized as her own, "Go inside and tell Lily to pack her things." "Abigail, your last name is Callaway," she said. "Your family's company is the one taking land from people like me. You've been on this farm for 2 weeks and you didn't tell me." She stopped. Her voice was starting to do something she wouldn't allow. She steadied it deliberately, the same way she'd learned to steady her hands on hard mornings. "Did you come here on purpose? Did you choose this farm?" "No," he said immediately. "The wheel broke. That was real. Everything I told you was real. Except your name." "Except my name." She looked at him. "You knew what your family was doing to farms like mine." "Yes." "And you thought 2 weeks of fence repairs evened that out somehow." "No." His voice broke slightly on the word, and he pushed past it. "No, I didn't think that. I knew it didn't. I just—" He stopped. He pressed his hand against the back of his neck, the way he did when something was working its way up through him that he didn't know what to do with. "I wanted to help you. That was true. Everything I felt here was true." "Everything you felt," she repeated. And something in how she said it, not cruel, just precise, made him go still. "Yes," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the fence line he'd repaired, and the irrigation channel he'd dug, and the barn door that didn't sag anymore, and she felt something pull in 2 directions so sharply she thought it might actually tear her in half. "The whole town is going to say I brought you here on purpose," she said. "That I found out who you were, and I played you for. Anyone who knows you would never believe that." "Nobody in that town knows me," she said flatly. "They see a fat, lonely spinster on a failing farm. And now they'll add desperate to the list." Her voice stayed level. She was enormously proud of that. "Go inside and get Lily." "Abigail, please. Please nothing," she said. "I am not angry at you, Ethan. I want you to understand that. I understand why you ran, and I understand why you didn't tell me, and I understand all of it, and it doesn't matter. What matters is that your family just accelerated my banknote, which means I've got 14 days to figure out how to save this farm, and I cannot do that with you here giving the whole county a story to tell about me." He looked at her like she'd hit him somewhere he hadn't thought to protect. "Will you let me help?" he said. "Just let me contact the attorney in Billings. Let me—" "Go," she said. not unkindly. "Go, Ethan." He went inside. She heard Lily's voice asking something, and Ethan's answer low and careful, and then Lily's voice again with a different quality to it, the particular devastating sound of a child trying not to cry because an adult has told them something that requires courage. Abigail sat down on the porch step. She put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since her father's funeral, and she wasn't going to start today. It was 2 hours later, wagon-packed horse-hitched, when things got worse. Because Richard Calloway had not gone back to wherever he came from. He had gone to Millhaven. Abigail found out how thoroughly he'd done it when Martha Coles rode up the drive with 3 other women from town, their faces holding the particular brightness of people delivering bad news they're somewhat enjoying. "We heard," Martha said, "about the Calloway boy." "Good for you," Abigail said. "People are saying you knew who he was from the start," Martha said. "They're saying you've been—" A meaningful pause. "Entertaining him, trying to get your hands on his family money. That you threw yourself at him because there's no other way a woman—" She stopped herself, but she'd already said enough. Abigail looked at her. Just looked at her. And something in Abigail's eyes made Martha drop hers first. "Get out of my yard," Abigail said. Ethan came around the side of the house and heard the last of it. His face went through several things very fast. He stepped forward and opened his mouth, and Abigail put her hand up without looking at him. "Don't," she said. "It'll only make it worse." He stopped. His hands were clenched at his sides. Martha and the women left. They didn't hurry. They never hurried. That was how they did it. When the sound of their horses faded, Lily came and stood beside Abigail and took her hand. She didn't say anything. She just held it. Abigail looked down at the child and felt something in her chest loosen and tighten at the same time. "I don't want to go," Lily said. "I know, sweetheart." "Then why do we have to—" Abigail looked at Ethan over the child's head. He was watching her with an expression she had no name for. Not grief exactly. Not just guilt. Something compound and deep and genuine that she made herself look away from because she couldn't afford to be moved by it right now. "Because sometimes things happen that make staying impossible," she said, "even when nobody wanted it that way." Lily looked up at her. "That's what Papa said about before," she said quietly. "About where we used to live." "He was right," Abigail said. She let go of the child's hand carefully. She looked at Ethan one last time. "Safe travels, Mr. Calloway," she said, and she went inside and closed the door. She stood in the kitchen with her back against the door and listened to the sound of the wagon moving down the drive, the horses' hooves on the dirt road fading steadily, growing smaller, going still. She stood there for a long time after the sound was gone. The kitchen was exactly the same as it always was. The flour on the counter, Lily's charcoal horses still on the table where the child had left them, the jar of dried beans, the 2 coffee cups from this morning that she still hadn't washed. She picked up Lily's drawing and held it. She stood there and held it for a long time, and then 3 hours later, when the sun had started its long summer drop and the kitchen had gone orange and quiet, she heard boots on the porch. A single pair, heavy, deliberate, and then silence, and then hooves, moving away. She went to the door and opened it. There was nothing on the porch except a folded piece of paper tucked under the coffee can she kept by the railing. She picked it up. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't an explanation. It was a receipt. From First Territorial Bank of Millhaven, dated that afternoon. Payment in full. Every dollar. Her father's note, the interest, the penalties. All of it. Settled. Stamped. Done. She sat down on the porch step with the receipt in her hand and stared at the empty road for a very long time. She sat on that porch step until the sky went dark. The receipt didn't change no matter how many times she unfolded and refolded it. The numbers didn't rearrange themselves. First Territorial Bank of Millhaven, payment in full. Every cent stamped and dated and real. She turned it over looking for something she'd missed, a condition. A clause, a string attached, because in Abigail Turner's experience, nothing this significant came without a price printed somewhere in small letters. There was nothing on the back. Just paper. She went inside, put the receipt on the table next to Lily's charcoal horses, and sat down in her father's chair. She sat there in the dark for a long time, not lighting the lamp, not moving, just letting the silence of the house come in around her, the way it always did after something large had happened. He'd paid her debt. He'd done it quietly, without asking her permission, without leaving a note asking for gratitude or credit or anything at all. He'd just done it and ridden away. The part of her that was practical, and that part was substantial, built over years of necessity, said that changed nothing between them. He was still a Calloway. His family's company was still the engine behind Briggs and Hartwell, and the slow dismantling of everything small farmers in this county had built. His money was still that money, no matter how clean the bank stamp looked. The other part of her, the part she kept quieter because it had gotten her into trouble before, said that a man who does something good when no one is watching and doesn't stay around to be thanked for it is doing it for exactly one reason. She went to bed. She didn't sleep. In the morning, she did the chores and tried not to notice how loud the barn was without Lily asking questions in it. 2 days passed before she went into Millhaven. She needed lamp oil, and she was not going to rearrange her life around what people said, so she hitched the wagon and went. It was worse than she had expected. Not because people were openly cruel, they'd learned to be subtler than that, but because of the way the conversation stopped when she came close and resumed when she moved away, and the way certain heads turned together with a specific tilt that meant a particular kind of talking. Patricia Harding didn't look at her at all when she came into the dry goods store, which was somehow more insulting than looking. She was loading the wagon when she heard it plainly from 2 men on the bench outside the feed store, voices not quite lowered enough. Heard she knew who he was from the start. Whole thing was a scheme. Woman her size figure, she'd take what she could get. She put the lamp oil in the wagon bed. She picked up the reins. She did not look at them. She drove out of Millhaven with her spine perfectly straight and her jaw set, and she did not let go of a single breath she was holding until she was a full mile down the road. Then she pulled up the horse and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. She'd heard things like that her entire life. Variations on the same theme, dressed up differently, depending on who was saying it and how brave they felt that day. She'd learned early that the best response was no response, that letting it land without reaction was the only kind of power she had over it. But something was different today. Something about hearing it said out loud with Lily's drawing still on her kitchen table, and that receipt folded in her coat pocket, made it feel less like the usual weight and more like a particular precise cruelty. She drove home. The attorney showed up the following morning. He rode out from Billings alone, a compact, sharp-faced man named Aldous Webb, and he introduced himself on the porch with a card and a briefcase, and the particular directness of someone who bills by the hour. Mr. Calloway arranged for my retainer before he left the county, Webb said. He asked me to review your situation and represent your interests against the bank and against Briggs and the Hartwell acquisition. No charge to you. He paused. He was quite specific about that last part. Abigail stared at him. He hired you before he left. Before he left, yes. He arranged this while he was still on my property. I received the letter 4 days ago, Webb said. He must have written it the same week Doyle came out the second time. He looked at her steadily. May I come in? She let him in. She put coffee on. She sat across the table from him and listened while he laid out what he knew. What he knew was considerable. Ethan Calloway had walked away from Calloway Corporation 2 years ago, immediately after his wife's death. He'd walked away not just from the board seat and the money, he'd walked away from the consolidation strategy that Richard had been building for a decade, which used shell companies like Hartwell to absorb farmland across the rural West under the guise of agricultural development. The plan involved buying land, cheaply consolidating it, and leasing it back to industrial farming operations that displaced every family who'd previously worked it. How many farms? Abigail asked. Across 3 counties, Webb said. 47 confirmed, possibly more. She pressed her hands flat on the table. Ethan knew about this, she said. He opposed it internally for 3 years before he left, Webb said. He lost. He walked away rather than be party to it. Webb folded his hands. The problem is, his divestment was never completed. Richard structured the charter deliberately to require Ethan's signature on all major acquisitions. Without it, Hartwell can't close. Without Hartwell closing, the whole consolidation strategy stalls. So Richard needs him, Abigail said slowly. Desperately, Webb said. There's a corporate hearing scheduled in 3 weeks, in Dallas. The board is convening to decide whether to force Ethan's divestment through legal proxy, essentially stripping him of his stake without his signature. If that happens, Richard gets full control, and the Hartwell acquisition closes automatically. Abigail was quiet for a moment. And if Ethan shows up and fights it, then the hearing becomes public record, Webb said. And the acquisition strategy becomes public record with it. And 47 farm families get their stories told in front of a board that would very much prefer those stories stayed quiet. He looked at her over his coffee cup. Mr. Calloway asked me specifically to gather documentation from affected families in this county. Letters, records, anything they're willing to provide. He plans to present it at the hearing. She sat back in her chair. He was going to fight his own family. He was going to walk into that room in Dallas and put the Calloway name on trial in public, knowing exactly what it would cost him, not just the inheritance, but whatever remained of the life he'd been born into. And he'd arranged for her attorney before he left, while she was telling him to go. Miss Turner, Webb said carefully, I want to be honest with you about what this hearing is likely to look like. Richard Calloway has resources, and he knows how to use them. If Ethan goes into that room without strong support, documented evidence, character witnesses, community voices, Richard will control the narrative. He'll paint Ethan as unstable, unfit. He paused. He'll make the case that a man who abandoned his responsibilities to live as a vagrant on a farm in Montana for 2 weeks is not a man whose judgment should be trusted on any matter. The word vagrant hit her somewhere specific. She recognized it as a word chosen for a reason. He'll use me, she said. The story about me. He'll use it to discredit Ethan. Almost certainly, Webb said. Yes. She looked at the table. She looked at the receipt still sitting there beside Lily's drawing. She looked at the attorney and said, what would help him? Actually help him. Webb was quiet for a moment. Testimony from someone the community respects. Someone who was there. Who knows what actually happened? Another pause. And who would be willing to say it in front of a corporate board in Dallas? The kitchen was very quiet. That's 3 weeks away, Abigail said. 22 days, Webb said. She nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee and didn't drink it, just held the cup. Leave me your card, she said. I'll think about it. He left. She sat at the table for a long time after he was gone. She thought about Dallas, which she'd never been to. She thought about corporate boardrooms, which she'd never seen. She thought about the kind of women who walked into those rooms and said things that mattered: what they wore, how they stood, how they spoke. And she thought about how different from those women she was in every measurable way. Then she thought about 47 farm families. She thought about Ethan standing in front of that board alone, and Richard with his polished lawyers and his prepared narrative, and the way a story looks when only one side of it gets told in public. She went to the Tuesday county meeting that week. She'd been going for 2 years, sitting in the back, speaking twice in all that time. She walked in and sat in her usual spot and listened to Harlan Briggs' attorney present a progress update on the Hartwell acquisition with the smooth confidence of a man who expects no opposition. She stood up. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they're surprised. I have documentation, she said, that Hartwell Industries is a subsidiary of Calloway Corporation out of Dallas, Texas, and that the acquisition agreement contains terms that violate the county's own homestead protection statutes passed in 1874. She held up Webb's preliminary analysis, which he'd left with her that morning specifically for this. I'd like to submit this to the record. Briggs's attorney stood up. Ma'am, this is not the appropriate— It is absolutely the appropriate venue, she said. Her voice didn't shake. She'd thought it might. It didn't. "This is a public meeting about public land, and I'm a member of this public. Sit down." He sat down. She wasn't sure who was more surprised, the room or herself. Afterward, 3 families she barely knew stopped her outside. The Hendersons, who'd been fighting Briggs for 6 months. Old Cal Pruitt, who'd been fighting longer. A young woman named Sarah Dodd, who'd moved back to her mother's farm after Briggs tried to accelerate her note the same way he'd tried with Abigail. "How'd you get that documentation?" Henderson asked. "An attorney in Billings," she said. "His name is Aldous Webb. You should contact him." "Can't afford." "He's already retained," she said. "For this county. You won't pay." She looked at them each in turn. "Talk to your neighbors. Find anyone Hartwell approached. Write down what happened, dates, amounts, what they said. Webb will need it." She walked back to her wagon, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time and didn't quite have the right word for. Not hope exactly. Closer to direction. The sensation of moving towards something instead of just holding ground against everything. The letter from Lily arrived 9 days later. It was 4 pages in a child's handwriting. The letters large and uneven and utterly serious, and Abigail sat down on the porch steps and read every word twice. Lily wrote about the road, about the towns they'd passed through, about a cat she'd seen in one of them that reminded her of the barn cat, and how she'd thought about Abigail when she saw it. She wrote about Papa being quiet in the way he got when he was carrying something heavy, and how she knew he was thinking about the farm, even when he didn't say so. Then, near the end, in the same matter-of-fact tone as everything else, Lily wrote, "Papa got a letter from Uncle Richard saying the hearing is going to put Papa's name in all the newspapers and say bad things about him so people think he's wrong in his head. Papa said it didn't matter. But he looked the way people look when something matters a lot, and they're pretending it doesn't. I think you would know what I mean because you make that face sometimes too." Abigail lowered the letter. She sat there very still. Then she read that part again. Say bad things about him so people think he's wrong in his head. Richard wasn't just going to argue business. He was going to publicly question Ethan's competence, his sanity. He was going to put a man who'd walked away from grief and corruption and a life he didn't choose in front of a public record and call him unstable. And the story about Abigail's farm was going to be Exhibit 1 in that argument. And there would be nobody in that room to say otherwise. Unless there was. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket next to the bank receipt. She went inside. She looked at herself in the small mirror by the washstand, something she actively avoided as a general rule, because the mirror showed her what Millhaven saw, and she didn't need that on an ordinary day. But she looked now deliberately, and she looked at the face looking back at her. She thought about what Ethan had said that night at the kitchen table I just noticed. That's all, and how she'd stood there with a water bucket feeling for the first time in years like being seen was not the same thing as being judged. She thought about Lily asking, "Are you still lonely?" and answering less than I was, and meaning every word of it. She thought about 47 families and a corporate hearing, and a man standing alone in a room full of people who'd already decided the story. She turned away from the mirror. She went to the desk where she kept the farm accounts and found the envelope she'd been putting small amounts into for 3 years, her emergency reserve, the fund she never touched, because touching it meant admitting the emergency had arrived. She counted it. She put Webb's card beside it. It was enough. Barely. But enough. She wrote 2 letters that night. One to Webb, asking him to arrange her testimony at the Dallas hearing and telling him what Lily had written about Richard's plan. The other to her neighbor, old Clementine Hatch, asking her to keep an eye on the farm and feed Rosie and the chickens while she was gone. She sealed both letters. She set them by the door for morning. She stood in the middle of her kitchen in the dark, the same kitchen where she'd heated beans for a stranger and his daughter, and something had shifted in her that she hadn't had a name for then and still wasn't sure she had a name for now. And she breathed. For the first time in a very long time, she was not thinking about the farm. She was not thinking about the banknote, or Briggs or Doyle, or Martha Coles, or any of the 1,000 small weights she'd been carrying so long. They'd started to feel like her own bones. She was thinking about a man who had looked at her like she was worth looking at. who had walked back into a store in Millhaven without explaining himself and come out without apologizing, who had paid a debt he didn't owe and ridden away without waiting to be thanked. And she was thinking that if she stayed on this porch one more day, waiting for the world to decide what she deserved, she was going to spend the rest of her life with Lily's drawing on her kitchen table and that receipt in her pocket, and nothing else to show for the summer that had changed her. She was done waiting. The stage to Billings left at 6 in the morning. From Billings, she could catch the rail south. She had 22 days. She went to bed at last, and this time she slept deep and immediate, the sleep of a person who has finally decided something that needed deciding. And in the morning she got up before dawn, fed the animals, left the letters with Clementine's boy when he passed on the road, and packed a bag. She didn't take much. She never had. She picked up Lily's drawing from the table and folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Then Abigail Turner, who had never in her life gone after anything she wanted, because she'd spent 30-some years being taught that wanting was for women who looked different than she did, walked out her front door and didn't look back. The train to Dallas took 2 days and a night, and Abigail spent most of it sitting straight-backed in her seat, watching the land change outside the window. Not because the view comforted her, but because looking at it kept her from looking at the other passengers, who looked at her the way passengers always did, with that particular sideways assessment she'd learned to ignore but never quite stopped feeling. She had Webb's briefcase documents in her lap. She read through them twice. By the second reading, she understood enough to be genuinely angry, which was better than being frightened, so she stayed there. 47 families. Accelerated banknotes timed specifically to harvest season when cash was lowest. Shell company layered over shell company so the Callaway name never appeared in the paperwork until it was too late to fight it. Legal, all of it the way things done by men with expensive attorneys were always technically legal, while the families sitting across from those attorneys in county offices had nobody. She folded the documents back into the case when Dallas came into view. Webb met her at the station with the particular efficiency of a man who has a great deal to do and has already started doing it. He walked fast and talked faster, steering her through the crowd without slowing down. "The hearing starts at 9 tomorrow morning," he said. "Richard's side has filed 3 motions to limit testimony scope, all denied, which tells you the board chair is at least not entirely in Richard's pocket. We have 14 letters from affected families. The Hendersons, the Prutts, Sarah Dodd's family, 11 others." "How'd you get them so fast?" she said. "You told them to write things down," Webb said. "They wrote things down." He glanced at her. People who've been waiting to be heard don't need much encouragement once someone tells them their words matter. She absorbed that. "What's Richard's strategy?" she asked. Webb's jaw tightened slightly. "He's going to argue that Ethan is emotionally compromised, unfit to hold any stake in the company. He has a physician's statement paid for in my opinion, but hard to disprove, suggesting that Ethan's decision to disappear for a year with his daughter shows signs of mental instability." A pause. "And he has a prepared account of Ethan's time in Millhaven that paints it as erratic behavior driven by his word and inappropriate entanglement." "With me," she said flatly. "Yes." She looked straight ahead. "He's going to put me in that room without putting me in that room." "That's right," Webb said. "Which is why your presence matters. You take away his ghost. You make it real and you make it human. And you make it something the board has to look at directly instead of accepting Richard's version of." She nodded once. "All right, Abigail." Webb stopped walking, which made her stop. He looked at her with the direct, unsparing eyes of a man who respects people enough to tell them hard things. "Richard has done this before. He's very good at it. He will say things tomorrow, designed specifically to make you feel small, to make you doubt why you came. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I've been made to feel small by experts," she said. "He'll have to get in line." Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Good," and started walking again. The hotel he'd booked for her was 3 blocks from the hearing hall. Modest, clean, entirely unfamiliar in the way that cities were entirely unfamiliar to her. Too much noise, too much light, too many people moving with the confidence of people who belonged somewhere. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, after Webb left her bag unpacked beside her, and she thought about the farm, about Rosie and the chickens, and the irrigation channel that was already carrying water to the east field, about the barn with the post where a name had been carved and then left behind. She was thinking about Lily's drawing in her coat pocket when someone knocked on her door. She opened it. Ethan stood in the hallway. He looked like he'd been on the road himself, thinner maybe, or just the light, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately organize into a single feeling, because it was too many things at once. Relief was in it, and something careful, like a man approaching something he's afraid to break. "Webb told me you were here," he said. "Did he?" She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him steadily. "You could have warned me. About the hearing. About what Richard was planning." "I know," he said. "You should have written." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "I didn't think you'd come." "I didn't either," she said. "Till I did." Something moved through his face. He pressed his lips together and looked down for a moment, and when he looked back up, his eyes were doing something she'd only seen once before on the porch, the day she'd told him to go, when he'd looked at her like she was a thing he hadn't been prepared to lose. "Lily's here," he said. "She's with Webb's wife. She doesn't know you're—" He stopped. "She's going to—" "Ethan," Abigail said quietly. "One thing at a time." He nodded. He cleared his throat. "How's the farm?" "It's there," she said. "Thanks to you." "Don't thank me for that." "I'm not thanking you," she said. "I'm telling you it's there. There's a difference." She straightened up. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She closed the door. She stood against it for a moment in the dark. Then she got into bed and slept better than she had in 3 weeks. The hearing hall was large, formal, and full of the kind of people who wore their money quietly. Board members, attorneys, a small number of journalists who'd been allowed in by arrangement. Webb had secured Abigail a seat near the front to the right of where Ethan would sit, and she watched the room fill up with the deliberate stillness she'd developed over years of being somewhere she wasn't entirely welcome. Richard arrived last. He was flanked by 4 attorneys, and he looked exactly as he'd looked on her porch. The expanding quality, the absolute certainty of a man who has never genuinely been stopped. He saw Abigail when he came through the door. His eyes paused on her for exactly 2 seconds, recalculating, and then he looked away. She watched that calculation happen and filed it away. The board chair, a gray-haired woman named Helena Marsh, who had the direct eyes of someone who had not gotten where she was by accepting things at face value, called the hearing to order with a briskness that immediately made Abigail feel slightly better about the proceedings. Richard's lead attorney opened with 40 minutes of prepared argument that was technically about corporate governance and was actually about Ethan's mental state, threaded through with language like erratic disappearance and dereliction of fiduciary responsibility and pattern of impulsive decision-making inconsistent with the demands of a major stakeholder position. It was polished and precise, and Abigail watched the board members' faces while it was delivered, and saw some of them leaning forward in the way people lean when something is confirming what they already suspected. Then came the physician's statement read into the record. Then came a carefully edited version of Ethan's time in Millhaven, a man of significant wealth and responsibility, abandoning his obligations to perform manual labor on a debt-ridden farm belonging to a woman with no apparent connection to his professional or personal circles that made the whole thing sound exactly as Richard had designed it to sound. Abigail kept her face still. She'd known it was coming. Knowing didn't make it easy to sit through. Ethan beside Webb at the respondents' table did not react visibly. He had the absolute stillness she recognized from the first night on her porch, and she knew now what it cost him to hold that stillness, and respected it enormously. When Richard's attorney finished, Helena Marsh turned to Webb. "Mr. Webb, your response." Webb stood up. He was measured and clear, and he walked through the Hartwell documentation with the precision of a man who had been building this argument for weeks, which he had. He presented the charter language that required Ethan's signature. He presented the evidence of Richard's shell company structure. He presented Ethan's internal objections, documented over 3 years, to the acquisition strategy letters, meeting records, a formal written dissent filed with the board secretary 18 months before Ethan left. Mr. Calloway did not abandon his responsibilities, Webb said. He fulfilled them. He opposed a strategy he believed, and the evidence suggests correctly, was being used to cause demonstrable harm to rural families across 3 counties. When that opposition failed through internal channels, he removed himself, rather than lend his name and his stake to an enterprise he found unconscionable. That is not instability. That is conscience. Richard leaned over to his attorney and said something. Helena Marsh said, "Does the respondent wish to make a personal statement?" Ethan stood. He spoke for 15 minutes without notes, in the same even unhurried voice he used when he was fixing fence rails or explaining the water table to Abigail across a kitchen table. He talked about the Hartwell acquisition in specific terms, not just what it did, but what it was designed to do, how it worked, who it targeted, and why they were targeted, how the timeline was coordinated with harvest season to maximize the pressure on families with no cash reserves. He talked about Clara briefly, and about what it had meant to watch his company become something he couldn't defend from the inside. And then he said, "I spent 2 weeks on a farm in Montana belonging to a woman named Abigail Turner. I was there because my wagon broke down and she offered shelter to my daughter and me when she had almost nothing herself to spare. I worked on her farm because I wanted to, because it was honest work that meant something, which is more than I was able to say about most of what I'd spent the previous decade doing." He paused. "I'm not ashamed of those 2 weeks. They were the clearest 2 weeks of the last 3 years of my life." Richard's attorney was on his feet before Ethan finished. "The board should note that Mr. Calloway's judgment regarding this woman and her farm is precisely the kind of—" "The board notes the objection," Helena Marsh said. "Sit down." He sat. She looked at Webb. "You have additional witnesses." "1," Webb said. "With the board's permission." Richard looked up. Webb gestured toward Abigail. She stood. She was aware of every person in the room, and she was aware of herself in that room, her size, her plain traveling dress, her face that was not the kind of face these rooms were built for, and she let herself be aware of all of it for exactly 1 second. Then she set it aside, the way she'd been setting it aside her whole life, with the difference that this time she set it aside deliberately as a choice, because she had something to say, and the room was going to hear it. "My name is Abigail Turner," she said. "I own 62 acres in Millhaven County, Montana. Harlan Briggs, acting through the Hartwell subsidiary of this corporation, spent 2 years trying to accelerate my banknote and force me off that land. He used the same methods on 46 other families I know of personally. I have their letters with me." She held up the stack. The room was very quiet. "Ethan Calloway spent 2 weeks on my property," she said. "He fixed my fence line. He dug an irrigation channel that's going to improve my east field yield for years. He arranged legal representation for me and for every other family Hartwell targeted in my county at his own expense before he left without telling anyone he'd done it." She looked directly at Richard when she said the next part. "He did not come to my farm to hide. He came because he was running from exactly this, from a family that turns land and people into numbers on a ledger and calls it prosperity." Richard's jaw was tight. He said carefully, "Miss Turner, I understand you have a personal interest in how this hearing—" "I have a personal interest in the truth," she said, "which is that your company targeted families who had nothing to fight with and no one to speak for them, and the one person in your own boardroom who tried to stop it, you're now trying to call crazy." Her voice was steady. She'd been steadier in harder rooms than this. "I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a board member, and I know that, but I was there. I saw who Ethan Calloway is when nobody's watching. And I'll tell you what I told the county meeting in Millhaven. There is always leverage when someone reaches too far. Your company reached too far, and we have the paperwork to prove it." She sat down. The room took a moment to come back to itself. Helena Marsh was looking at the stack of letters Webb had passed forward. She was reading quickly, her expression neutral and exact. 2 other board members leaned toward her. A third had already turned to speak quietly to the person beside him. Richard leaned toward his attorney. His attorney leaned back. What passed between them was brief and not good by the look on Richard's face afterward. The deliberation took 40 minutes. Abigail sat with her hands folded and waited. Ethan sat 2 tables over and didn't look at her, which she understood looking would have broken something in the waiting, and they both knew it. When Helena Marsh came back in the room, went silent before she sat down. The board finds insufficient evidence to support the motion for forced divestment on grounds of stakeholder incapacity, she said. Mr. Ethan Calloway retains his stake and his full rights under the founding charter. She paused and looked directly at Richard. The board further finds that the Hartwell acquisition raises significant questions under the county homestead statutes referenced in the submitted documentation and is referring those questions to outside counsel for review. Pending that review, the Hartwell acquisition is suspended. She set down her papers. This hearing is closed. Richard stood up so fast his chair scraped. Helena, this board does not have the authority to— Sit down, Richard, she said, and her voice was the same one it had been all morning, flat and certain, and without any interest in argument. Or I will have you removed from this room, and that will be a matter of public record. He sat down. In the hallway afterward, Webb shook Abigail's hand with both of his, and said something she didn't entirely hear, because the blood was very loud in her ears, and her knees had chosen that particular moment to inform her that they'd been holding a great deal of tension for a great deal of weeks, and were ready to stop. She was standing against the wall, breathing carefully when Lily found her. The child came around the corner at a dead run, and stopped 2 feet away, and looked up at Abigail with her father's dark eyes, and her face was doing 6 things at once, and she said, "You came." "I came," Abigail said. Lily crossed those 2 feet and put her arms around Abigail's waist and held on with the absolute uncomplicated conviction of a child who has decided that this person matters and there is nothing complicated about it. Abigail put her arms around the child and closed her eyes. Ethan came around the corner a moment later and stopped when he saw them. He stood there with his hat in his hands and his face open in a way she'd never seen at all. The controlled stillness finally set aside, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Abigail." She looked at him over Lily's head. "Come home," he said. It was simple. Just those 2 words. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 62 acres of bottomland, and the irrigation channel, and the east field, and the barn with the carved post, and Rosie, and the old cat, and the porch where she'd sat alone for 3 years, watching the road, and learning to be content with a life that had never once felt quite finished. "You mean Montana," she said. "I mean wherever you are," he said. She had things she could have said to that. A practical woman had practical responses ready. But she looked at him standing there in a courthouse hallway in Dallas, with his hat in his hands and his whole face showing, and she thought that sometimes the only answer a thing deserves is the true one. "Then let's go home," she said. They were back in Mill Haven before the summer ended. The farm work that fall was different from any work Abigail had done before. Not because it was easier, because it wasn't, but because it wasn't done alone. Ethan worked the east field with the same unhurried precision she'd watched from across the fence line in July, and the channel ran full and clear, and the yield from the second harvest was the strongest the Turner land had seen in a decade. Webb's review of the Hartwell acquisition resulted in 3 families recovering deeds they'd already signed away. The other families in the county kept their land. Harlan Briggs left Mill Haven County before October and did not come back. Abigail did not miss him. The morning Lily called her mom was a Tuesday in late September, entirely unannounced, in the middle of an ordinary conversation about whether the chickens needed more feed before winter, and Lily said it the way she said everything, simply and directly, and with the full weight of having thought about it and decided, and Abigail stopped what she was doing and stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, they do. Come help me carry it." And Lily did, and they did not make a ceremony of it because the best things rarely require one. That evening, Ethan came in from the field and found Abigail at the counter making bread, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her with that expression she'd learned to read, now the one that wasn't a smile exactly, but held one inside it, and she said without looking up, "Supper's in an hour." "I know," he said. He didn't move from the doorway. She looked up. "She called you Mom today," he said. "She did." He was quiet for a moment. "How was that?" "Oh." Abigail looked at him. She thought about the woman who had sat on a porch step in July with a receipt in her hands and Lily's drawing on her kitchen table, and a silence in the house so complete she could hear herself not breathing. She thought about 30-some years of being told in every language cruelty has available to it that she was too much of some things and not enough of others to deserve the ordinary miracles that other people seem to collect without trying. It was exactly right, she said. And it was. It was exactly right, and the farm was exactly right, and the man standing in her doorway watching her with all the patience in the world was exactly right, and Abigail Turner, who had spent a lifetime being told she was the wrong size and the wrong kind, and too stubborn and too alone and too far from what love was supposed to look like to ever find her way to it, finally understood what she should have known all along. She had never been hard to love. She had simply been waiting for someone honest enough to show her what it looked like when the looking was real.